interesting. But you talked before about systems that go through a change and then they evolve in a higher level, like Prigozhin's
Right.
theory.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about. Exactly.
I know, but I read in your book, which I didn't knew before, that before Prigozhin talked about dissipative structures, there were two persons that started before with some the catastrophe,
Right.
Bogdanov, and the other one I don't remember. You.
Well, René Thom was one.
Yes.
He had a theory called catastrophe theory.
Yes.
And this whole, oh, I know whom you mean, Bertalanffy.
Bertalanffy.
Yeah, Ludwig von Bertalanffy
Yes.
was an Austrian biologist who created the concept of an open system, and who pointed out that the key difference between a non-living and a living system is, or one of the key differences, is that a living system is always open to these flows of energy and matter. And Prigozhin then used complexity theory and this new mathematics to formulate a whole theory of open system and open thermodynamics or non-equilibrium thermodynamics. You see, another way of saying this is that in a living system there's always activity. There are always these chemical processes that take in matter and energy, process it, recycle things continuously, excrete the waste products. Equilibrium, chemical equilibrium, means when all the chemical processes that can happen have already happened and nothing more happens. Maybe there's a little process, something goes from here to here and then it goes back and forth, but very small. That's chemical equilibrium. And Prigozhin noticed that life is non-equilibrium. So he created a whole non-equilibrium science and non-equilibrium thermodynamics using the new mathematics that Bertalanffy could not use because in the 1930s that was not available.
Do you think, Fritjof, that in the we are now in like a global crisis, no?
Right.
Is this perhaps a stage that from here we might arrive to a better level?
Absolutely, yes. This kind of what is now often called emergence, the emergence of new order. We could say that globally we find ourselves in a state of planetary emergence.
Yes.
Now, there's no guarantee that something will emerge. The whole thing could break down. We could destroy ourselves, and the chances are, just about 50-50. So it's a very critical situation. But it's very important that we focus our attention on these real problems that we have. And as you know, politicians and the media usually try to deal with day-to-day political problems, but which are not really important. In the grand vision, they're not the essence. To create sustainable societies. Now, to create sustainable societies and sustainable communities also means to nurture community. If you took any newspaper today and looked through all the columns and everything that is reported, and then made two lists, and on one you had environmental problems that have to do with the destruction of the environment, and on the other list you have problems that have to do with the destruction of community. That covers most of the problems we have today. And when we create sustainable communities, we not only sustain the web of life, we also sustain the community. We nurture the community, and we need to realize that this is one and the same thing, because ecosystems are communities. These networks of organisms that work together and live together are communities. And this is the term that ecologists use. They say, the plant communities, the animal communities, and so on. And so the principles of ecology can also be understood as principles of community. which is another very important part. And I think, especially here in the South, people have become very aware of that this global economy that we have now, the global capitalism, introduces a level of global economic activity from the top that destroys local communities. And so poor countries especially are told that the best way to participate, to be competitive in the global economy, is to produce one product, whether it's sugarcane or coffee or whatever the product is, and export it to get foreign currency. And so to concentrate on this one product then diverts resources from the local agriculture, the local rice fields, the local food production, and destroys the community. So very often the best land is taken to grow crops for export, not for food for the local population. So this is destructive. It's not only environmentally destructive, but also destructive of local communities. So environment and community really goes hand in hand. And this is also important to realize, because the technologies that are environmentally sound are labor-intensive technologies. So you solve two problems. By changing the technologies and lifestyles, you solve two problems. You become ecologically sustainable, and you create a lot of jobs. Because all these energy systems, solar energy, for instance, is labor-intensive. Nuclear energy or fossil fuel energy is not labor-intensive. And so, because solar energy is used best in a decentralized way. You don't have huge power plants producing solar energy. You have little collectors, you have little systems, you have windmills, you have little generators in streams and so on. And all this is very labor intensive. So you create a lot of jobs. That goes hand in hand. So it's living ecologically sound, creating and maintaining community, and creating jobs. That goes hand in hand.
It's more like a rural setting, no?
Yes.
That the problem should be surely to that big cities.
Yes.
How do you handle big cities and this problem? Or there's this
exactly.
equilibrium.
You see, what happens is very often that with this new rule, with these new rules of the global economy, people are told that they have to produce things for cash, for foreign currency, and so instead of having small farmers producing a variety of crops, they produce a single crop. It's all mechanical, it's all machines on huge fields, and the family farms have to be given up, and so the farmers migrate to the cities and become unemployed and become part of the poverty of the cities. So all this needs to be reversed. But also, Marisa, I think we have to be clear that we're not advocating going back to the past, because rural life can also be very miserable. We are advocating a mixture of new technologies, like photovoltaic cells and new solar powered vehicles, and we can build houses now where the windows serve as the air conditioning, where they're sort of smart windows. They're called super windows. They insulate and regulate the temperature. Yeah. And so all these are sophisticated new technologies. We're not advocating, going back to the Middle Ages. We're advocating a decentralized, ecologically oriented technology. And the whole field is best described as ecological design or eco-design. And this is a big area now where many people are working in.
There should be also surely more consciousness in people to be able to implement all these changes.
Yes, and you see these technologies are really more efficient and therefore cheaper than the technologies we have now. But the economy is structured in such a way, and politics is structured in such a way, that the old technologies get a lot of subsidies from government. Okay. So if you build cars, even if you grow tobacco, which is not a healthy thing to do, you get a lot of subsidies from government. And so it's very uneven, as we say in America. It's an uneven playing field, and we have to level the playing field, and this requires a reorientation of the tax structure, because the things that are really expensive and damaging to humanity should be taxed, like toxics, fossil fuel, energy, and so on. And the things that...
Do you mean that they should pay a higher tax?
Higher tax.
So if they want to do it, they should pay much more.
Yeah. And the things that are abundant, now what's the most abundant resource we have? People. Same. The millions of people all over the world. They shouldn't be taxed. So there should be no employment tax. So we should shift the taxes from income tax and employment tax to ecological or green taxes, so that if you live an ecologically sound lifestyle, you shouldn't pay taxes. The people who pollute should pay the taxes, you see. Now, if that happens, then every competition in business will automatically be a competition for a better environment, because the ecological things will be the more effective and will give you more profit, because they will cost less. You pay less taxes. So in agriculture, for instance, organic farming will be the cheapest. Chemical farming will be more expensive. Now it's the opposite. So that's what we have to change.
It's a big change all the same for people.
And all these things are happening already. For instance, in Europe, there are several countries who have started that. Norway, Sweden, Holland, Austria, there are several countries, and this is called an ecological tax reform.
That's very interesting. It's working since
since the last 5 years or so.
And it's working well.
And well, it's a complicated subject, and people need to realize that I'm not talking about new taxes. You see, whenever you mention taxes, I don't want to pay more tax.
No one wants to pay any more.
Right. So it's a shift of taxes. There are 3 conditions to this ecological tax reform. The first is that it is a shift of taxes, so the total taxes for the government will be the same. The government will not collect more taxes, but it'll be a shift. The income taxes will go down, and the ecological taxes of raw materials and energy will go up. So, as I said before, if you produce something in an ecologically sound way, you'll pay less tax. If you live ecologically sound, you pay less tax. The second condition is that it's a shift that cannot be introduced from one year to the other. It has to be slowly going.
Implemented.
Yeah. So it has to be, 2%. You tax energy and raw materials 2%. Then you go up to 5%, then you go up to 7%. So it's a slowly rising tax shift. And the third condition is that it must be precisely specified by government, so that businesses can look ahead into the future and change the design. Because these changes of design you can't do, you have to shift your investment, and you can't do it from one year to the other. But over a 10-year period, over a 20-year period, you can do. And people often say, when you talk about sustainability and ecological lifestyles, you say, well, people are so lazy and they don't want to change, and it's so difficult to change people. And that is true. But business is not difficult to change, because businesses always look ahead, and they calculate ahead. And they calculate what their costs will be, what their profit margins will be. So if you introduce a new tax framework, they will adapt to it very quickly, because businesses are also very creative. And so this is absolutely necessary.
It's very interesting, the concept. But as we all function as in a global, we are one whole. we would need this to be implemented consequently in all the planet.
Yes.
Because otherwise, no?
Otherwise, there's a competitive advantage of
yes, advantage of some over the other, because the one that harms the planet.
That's right. This has to be implemented at the level of the G7, the leading industrial nations.
Yes, as a global totality.
But you know, it will be implemented when the awareness is there. I think first you have to raise the awareness of people, and you and I, you know, have that in common. We work in this field, you know, raising people's awareness. You with your programs, and I with my books. You
with your books and your work and your lectures.
So our conversation is going all over the place.
Yeah, no, but it's very interesting because I mean, I believe everybody now is worried about what we are, the way we are living, the problems we are having. What you taught about climate changes. For example, here in Argentina, for the last year, we had 2 days of sun and 1 day of rain. 2 days of sun. This is quite uncommon. There's a whole shift in climate, and how you said, floods every. You know, if we don't take care, and if we don't.
And you know, when you look at the newspapers and the television, they talk about natural disasters, and it's true, they're natural disasters, but they're human-made.
Claro, generated by man.
And this should be emphasized. In England, when they had these big floods a couple of months ago, Prince Charles spoke out, and he said, "This is human folly, you know, and we have to change our ways." And so he's one of the spokespersons of this, you know, change of awareness.
Because I believe it's also very important what you do in teaching small children.
Yes.
No, because they are it's very difficult when people are bigger to make a shift.
That's right. That's right. I want to talk about something else, Marisa, about the global economy a little more.
No, very interesting.
Because you know, we can sit here and talk about ecology and the nature of life and so on, and people will listen to that, but then they go out into their jobs, and then they're faced with a very different environment, and they say, well, you know, how does this relate?
Perfect.
So what we're witnessing now is something very unique, the so-called new economy, which emerged in the 1990s. And it emerged as a consequence of the information technology revolution. Globalization is first and foremost a global communications network that we now have. And the global communications network is not only television and news and the arts and science and so on, but is also, and even more importantly, communications about financial transactions. And so over the years, a new form of capitalism has emerged, which is a capitalism organized around networks of financial flows. And today we have these global networks that are computer directed and managed by computer systems, and people and companies invest in these financial flows, in these financial networks, and they are able to shift their investments within minutes or even within seconds, and pull them out from one industry into another, from one country into the other. It's a whole global interconnected network of financial flows. And this is where the main power lies today, the main economic power, because of this amazing flexibility of these networks. The profit margins in the financial networks are usually higher than in investment, say, you know, in producing shoes or producing cars or any kind of material goods. And so all profits from the so-called real economy ultimately are invested in this meta network of financial flows. And this meta network of financial flows is commonly called the global market, but it's not really a market. It's really a system of computers that is, it's really ultimately a big automaton, a big machine. And so economic life and economic power and political power is largely dependent on a network of machines. And so this old fear that we have had in science fiction novels that machines will take over is now becoming a reality, not because we have robots that will kick the humans out like in science fiction movies or novels, but because we have this financial network that dominates our lives, our businesses, and which is very basically computer oriented. And this automaton, this network of computer systems, is programmed by humans, of course, and it is programmed according to one single value, the value of making money. So whenever you see an opportunity somewhere in the world to make more money, then you will pull out, your millions or billions. If you're George Soros, you will pull out your billions
one place
from Argentina, and you will invest somewhere in Malaysia, and then you will yank it out from Malaysia and you put it into Poland or any other place within minutes, within seconds. And so if the industry you invest in is environmentally destructive, you don't care. If it violates human rights, you don't care. You just look at the profit margins and at the stock value. So this is a global system that is programmed according to the single value of profit making and money making. Now, human values are not natural laws. We don't need to do it that way. We can reprogram the global economy so that ecological values and the values of justice and human dignity are included. And it is precisely because of the tremendous sophistication and versatility of these technologies that we could reprogram the whole thing and introduce different values through taxation and so on. To just give you an example, there is a tax proposed by an economist called Tobin, and is known as the Tobin tax, which would tax international financial transactions, and it would put a very small tax, maybe 2 or 3% on these transactions. So every time you transfer your money from Argentina to Russia or to Europe, you would pay a small tax. Now, for ordinary businesses, this will be unimportant. It's a very small tax. But for these huge speculators, it will be important. So it would calm down the global financial system. You can introduce ecological taxes. You can introduce human rights taxes. I mean, every financial transaction could be marked with a marker, and the technology is so sophisticated that, for instance, these taxes, ecological or financial transactions or human rights, could automatically be deducted. They could go to an account, say, of the United Nations. They could be applied for environmental projects and so on. All this is feasible. Technology is not the problem. It's human values, and therefore it's a problem of politics. And I think this needs to be clearly recognized. So we're not victims of these machines, and we can't say, well, it's the computers who tell us. We program the computers, and we could program differently according to different values.
Sorry, Fritjof, when you say human rights taxes, could you give us an example, or what do you mean by?
Well, for instance, you could tax child labor. Child labor is illegal in many countries. In others, it is not. You could say, there should be no child labor, or you should have a minimum wage. You should have some social security for workers' conditions. All these things that socialism has fought for many years. Now, with the fall of communism, there are many advantages, of course, to the fall of communism. We got rid, people in various countries got rid of autocratic totalitarian regimes, like the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, was a huge success, or the cultural transformation in South Africa and so on. But with the fall of communism came also the disappearance of a regulatory system of capitalism. Now, for the first time, we have a situation where around the world, the entire global economy is organized according to a single set of rules. And these rules are not environmentally sound, and they don't take into account human dignity and human justice. But they could. You could rearrange, and we have to, of course.
Do you know, when you described all the automat, how it works, the economy inside the web or the machines,
Right.
it's very impressive. And perhaps people do a transaction and work this way, but they don't realize the whole system.
Right.
No?
This is in my new book. I talk about this. I have a whole chapter.
Very impressive, the description.
And I should also mention there is a detailed work has been done by a professor of sociology at the University of Berkeley, and his name is Manuel Castells, and he's Catalan, and he has published all over the world, and he has written a trilogy of 3 books, and it is called The Information Age, Science, Society, and Culture. And the first book is called The Rise of the Network Society. He talks about the network society because networking is a structure now that is prevalent in economics, in corporate life, and in these global networks. Now, this is interesting because networks are also in the web of life. The web of life is also networks. So we have to adapt our human networks by introducing these values, as I said before.
But as these networks, for example, about the computer and the transactions and this economy, it's some, how do you say, it has no rules, no? It's kind of anarchic.
Yeah.
How can you?
That's very good that you.
See.
That's very good that you bring that up. Well, these networks are highly unstable. And they are unstable because the investors or speculators, as we said before, can take the money, put it somewhere, immediately pull it out, put it somewhere else. The whole thing is like a global casino. It's like playing roulette, you see?
But no personal compromise.
Right. And this global casino has the effect that the entire system is very unstable. So it is a nonlinear system, and there are turbulences. When you have an unstable system like this, in life, in the web of life, there are stabilizing processes. Here in the global economy, there's no stabilizing process. Now, this Tobin tax that I mentioned would be a stabilizing process because it would prevent speculators from shifting around their money very wildly. But since it doesn't exist, the whole system is very unstable. And so now you have various effects. You have, for instance, companies that have annual reports of earnings or quarterly reports of earnings. And there are some analysts that say, for instance, let's take a recent example, the computer company Intel reported that their profits for the last quarter were, I don't know, 6% or something like this. I don't remember the numbers, but some numbers, right? Now, there are some analysts that say, well, we really expected 10%. So they're really lower than the expectations. Now, people who invest in this company think, oh, they're lower than the expectations. We pull our money out, right? Now, this is just the psychological, subjective perception of some people in the global markets. This company produces excellent products. They make profits. they have increased their profits over the last year. But some people think they haven't increased them enough. As a consequence, within days, their stocks dropped 40%. So you have very subjective perceptions. You have perceptions of, politics. For instance, just from the United States of the last few weeks, we had this debacle with presidential elections. It didn't change the stock market very much. The stock market just, wait and see, fluctuated a little bit. Then a few days ago, Alan Greenspan, the chair of the Federal Reserve, said he may lower interest rates. The stock market went boom up, right? Alan Greenspan is really the president of the United States. The other politicians are really not so important. So the perception or policy of one man and this organization influences everything. Now, in addition to all that, you have turbulences that nobody can predict because the network is too complex. So, for example, we had a series of environmental crises. A crisis in Mexico, a crisis in Asian countries, a crisis in Brazil. These crises had nothing to do with the local economies. These were fluctuations of the global economy. And who knows, what you are going through now in Argentina probably has very little to do with the national economy of the country, but has more to do with the fluctuations of the global economy. So it is absolutely necessary to calm down this system and make it more stable, in addition to making it environmentally sound and introduce these other values.
Which would be the way to calm the system, or which things we could do?
Well, all the things, many of the things that speculators do now to make money. For instance, they see a so-called emerging market. You have an emerging market in, I don't know, Malaysia or in Korea or in some country, and say the country was very poor, and now it had some new technologies, it had some new systems in place, and so now they have strong growth. They grow 8%, they grow 20%. So the investors or speculators, the people who play in the global casino, go into this country and invest billions of dollars. So the country grows, then it becomes unstable. At the first sign of instability, whether it's real or even perceived, the investors pull out the money. Now this creates havoc, because a large economy like the United States or Brazil or the European economy can absorb fluctuations, but a small country cannot absorb the fluctuations. So there's an economic crisis. So what you have to do, you have to set in place rules through the WTO, the G7, these organizations, the World Bank and so on, that investors are not allowed to put their money into a small country and pull it out right away. And these things can be forbidden. In other words, global capitalism needs to be regulated. Now, this is not an easy problem.
No.
And I'm not the expert to propose the detailed solutions, but I know it can be done. And I know it's a question of politics and human values. It's not a technical problem. It's also a technical problem, but the technical problem can be solved.
No, but it's important to detect the problem, to know how the system could be rearranged. No, you are starting the way to solve it, and then people should be aware, and they should try to implement it.
The awareness that something is wrong and that different values need to be introduced is the beginning.
Fundamental, yes, it's like the turning point.
Right. So what is emerging now in science is a new understanding of life, which, as I mentioned before, I called the systems view of life already many years ago. And this is an understanding in terms of networks, in terms of flows of energy, in terms of the emergence of novelty, creativity, evolution, and so on. And I think it's important to realize that we need a new way of thinking to understand life, living systems in this way, and I call this systems thinking. And this is something that actually emerged a long time ago in science. This is an old tradition that went through the 20th century, the tradition of systems thinking. And I think the best way to describe it is to historically tell you that when it emerged in the 1920s and 1930s, scientists came up with a sort of a manifesto, a slogan, which is the whole is more than the sum of its parts, which is very well known now. And so they argued about are the laws of physics and chemistry enough to describe life, or do you need something more? And it turned out, when they said the whole is more, what is needed is an understanding of relationships, of patterns. So we have a shift of thinking from the parts to the whole, and from objects to relationships. And this is something very new in science, because when you remember when you learned science in school or college, they would always tell you what is scientific needs to be quantified. It needs to be measured and weighed. But when you talk about relationships, you cannot put relationships on the scale and weigh them. They cannot be quantified. But relationships can be mapped. So you draw a map, of interconnections. You have a picture, a visual image. And so systems thinking is also a shift from measuring to mapping. And another way of saying this is it's a shift from quantity to quality. These are qualitative relationships. Actually, in the new mathematics of complexity, there's now a technical term called qualitative analysis. This is something very new, because analysis used to be always quantitative. For example, when you're sick and you go to a doctor, the doctor takes a blood test and he sends it to the lab to make an analysis. What do they do at the lab? They measure the chemical substances in the blood, and they make a quantitative analysis of the amounts of chemical substances. So analysis has always been a quantitative measurement. Well, now in complexity theory, analysis is also qualitative. You have a pattern, a mathematical geometric pattern that represents the dynamic of the system you're studying, and you do a qualitative analysis, an analysis of connectedness of relationships. So it's a shift from quantity to quality. And in fact, when we study relationships, there are two kinds of relationships of a living system. One is the relationships among its components, and the other are relationships between the system as a whole and its larger environment. And this is what we call context. Context are relationships to other things in the environment. So the best way I find to characterize systems thinking is to say that it is contextual thinking. It is a shift of thinking from the parts to the whole, from objects to relationships, from measuring to mapping, from quantity to quality. And it's important to realize that I'm not saying that we should forget about the parts and we should forget about measurement. That's still important, but we need both. And this thinking is absolutely crucial to understand ecosystems and to understand life.
How interesting. The example you put about when we go to a medicine and he makes us a blood test, no? Yeah. And it would be important that they should check now how everything works as a whole.
Right. Now, interestingly, there is such a medical system, and that's the Chinese medical system. You see, a Chinese doctor would not take a blood test. A Chinese doctor feels your pulse and maps out complex patterns of energy flows, the meridians, and it's all based on the yin-yang theory, and it's a very complex medical system. It is very successful, it is very effective, and it's on a totally different basis. It's a qualitative system, patterns and relationships.
But they work on an energy system basis, no?
Right.
How to reorganize flows of
yeah,
energy.
The patterns are patterns of energy flow.
Patterns of energy.
Right.
Do you believe too that in natural systems, what interconnects them? It's like a flow of energy,
yes,
and like an intelligent.
Well, it's a flow of energy. It depends now. You see, the patterns are the same in different living systems, but the actual flows are different. So in a cell, you have chemical flows. In an ecosystem, you have relationships, feeding relationships of species feeding on each other. But there's an intelligence embedded in all these flows. Yes, and as I mentioned before, in human systems we have flows of conversations and their concepts and ideas. Now, if we say that there's an intelligence embedded in nature, it doesn't mean that living systems all think, or they have concepts and they have symbols. That's a characteristic of human consciousness. But they are adaptable, they are creative, and that's the intelligence in nature. For instance, let's just take an example, a well-known example. I have a cat at home, and we feed our cat every morning, and if the cat has a certain path, into the kitchen. If this path is blocked, the cat can find an alternative.
Claro.
It can open a door even, and has become very good at it. Now, it's an intelligent animal. If you have a flow of pebbles, for instance, in an avalanche, the avalanche cannot find an alternative. It will just go through the closed door with a lot of force. It's a natural force, a physical force. It's not intelligent. Every animal, every plant, every microorganism has the intelligence in different degrees of multiple solutions to problems, of alternatives, of adaptability, of creativity. Creativity also in evolution. That's the natural intelligence. It doesn't mean now that bacteria write poetry. It's not that kind. It's not that kind of consciousness. But there is an inherent intelligence in all of nature. And the intelligence is an individual intelligence, and even more importantly, a collective intelligence. The entire web of life is intelligent.
But it's like intelligence for the smaller systems, each one a peculiar intelligence, and then a whole, a bigger that interconnects the whole.
And the intelligence goes with the complexity of the system. Different complexities have different levels of intelligence, because the diversity, the creativity, the multiple alternatives, all that increases with increasing complexity.
How interesting. How interesting. Well, Fritjof, thank you very much. Thank you for all your concepts, and thank you for being here. It has been a pleasure having you on the program.
Pleasure.
Thank you.